Today, on this Sunday, we are having our weekly recap on how things have been going in Mythic Plus. A bit late, it's not 7 days later, it's more like a week and a half later. We are not even just past week 8 of the season, more like halfway through week 9 of the season at this point. It is still a pretty fitting timing to have it, because this is just right after the announcement of the balance tuning that will come in this weekly reset. So we can look at the situation in Mythic Plus with also in mind what is going to change with the balance tuning, and also knowing that right after the weekly reset with this balance tuning coming on May the 6th, the week right after May the 13th is when there is going to be a big jump in power for all characters, since everyone will be able to increase their average item level by 6, as well as getting their first best in slot item trinket, mostly from the vendor, from the dinar vendor that will be added, which is partially, possibly and likely also why the pushing has taken a bit of a backseat in this past week. The average key level being pushed has been plateauing roughly around a 16.5 average key level, mostly because at this point, once you are told that in just about 10 days you will be able to increase your item level by 6, as well as get your hands on a best in slot trinket, you know that when that happens you will be able to push 1, possibly 2 key levels higher just because of that power increase. So most of the pushing that happens now is about to be made somewhat obsolete in just a few days. Regardless though, what is worth to be mentioned in this past week and a half is of course what we had already pre-announced and then announced, and now we have the full picture of it, which was the turnover of arcane mages now being the choice over fire. You can see here the first week when that started to happen, fire went down from 15% of the top keys being fire to 6%, while arcane went from 2 to 12. The week after that, last week, we had 18% of mages being arcane and only 2% of mages being fire, and now you have only less than 1% of the mages being fire up to this week, with 19% of the mages being arcane. We can say though, even though with this switch, of course, we have gotten now arcane to take over fire, and we have mentioned also already why, pretty much, right? Arcane mage is primarily just better at doing prior damage, simply because of the way their arcane barrage works. Yes, they are a bit more limited in flat out wide multi-count number AoE, but that is exactly why you have balanced Druid and Unholy Decay in your group. They are going to take care of that kind of damage profile. Arcane is much better at lower target count AoE, so 3 to 4 to 5 at max enemies is where arcane can do extremely well, and then even in AoE they still have the power of the funnel, or rather of the prior damage on one of the targets, the one they choose to target with arcane barrage first. For example, you can see here a dark flame cleft pool where of course you see the Unholy Decay doing tons of AoE damage. This is a boss pool, except the first boss is being pulled with a whole bunch of other mobs. And you can see that most of the damage of the decay will be in AoE to the menial laborers, whereas the damage of the arcane mage will be about focusing the boss primarily. That's kind of the advantage you get when playing arcane mage in this comp, specifically with these two other specs. However, we can also say that while arcane mage is now the default third pick in this comp, it is still quite a fair bit below popularity of both Unholy and Balance. In fact, it is roughly 30-ish% less popular than Unholy and then Balance. If you compare it, for example, to the trio of popularity of last season, which for the most part was Augmentation, Enhancement and Frost Decay, for example, you now in this season have more room to find an alternative to Mage in your groups. It has just now started to get a little bit more strict than usual. You see here the meta score practically of the comp. The higher the number, the more strict the comp is, and it was for quite a while in the low 700 range, the score of the DPS. Compare this to the score of the DPS last season, it was in the high 700 range, and even if you go back to Dragonflight, the last season was for the most part breaking into the 800 range due to how strict it was. You had a period of truce in Season 3 after augmentation was deleted for a while, so you had more room for other specs to be played outside of AUG, and before that, of course, when AUG was still existing, it was again extremely oppressive. So this season is still not nearly as oppressive, even now with Arcane gaining more ground over Fire. We can also say somewhat the same actually for healers, because despite Discipline being your to-go pick, it is still, averaging, especially after the nerf. After the nerf to Discipline, it has gone down. It was starting to rise, of course, more and more, but after the nerf, it has pretty much plateaued at 70% popularity, which is actually okay-ish. If you look at the healing score when it comes to the meta, how strict the meta is compared to the previous season, for example. The previous season was significantly more strict in how much more Discipline was being played, and it's not that the seasons prior were any less strict. Before the pre-patch of the expansion, you still had more strictness with Resto Druid in Season 4. Again, Season 3, with the nerf of augmentation, opened up more room for healers. This was the more open season, pretty much, in recent memory, and again, more strictness back when Holy Paladin was in charge. So also for healers, actually, this season is more open. Now, you would be wondering why exactly, since when you look at the top keys, you mostly just see Discipline Priest, right? But we are talking in here about the top 2000 keys. We're not just talking about the world first plus 19 completed or world first plus 20 completed. It's a bit of a larger breadth of keys available, and there is more freedom there for healers as well. At the moment, as we have seen already, you do see more options outside of Unholy and Balance, simply because, as we have been seeing since the very early weeks of this season, the two specs that have been at the top when it comes to flat out AoE damage have been Unholy and Balance. So those two remained as part of the main meta comp, whereas the third slot was more of a last pick, basically, in the draft. It was the last pick being Fire Mage. And now it's being moved to Arcane, and Arcane is still the one that is being, replaced the most for other picks, other more niche picks. Maybe it's Ret, maybe it's Devastation, maybe it's Enhancement. Either way, when you have to pick between the three, between Unholy, Balance, and Arcane, Arcane is the one. Prior to them it was Fire, now it's Arcane, is the one that gets replaced the most out of the other two DPS specs. Obviously, we also have the notion that one of these two DPS specs is about to be nerfed. In a few days, Unholy will get a nerf to its very powerful AoE. Unfortunately though, this, as we mentioned already, won't really change much, because the AoE is going to be nerfed by roughly 3-ish%. So this 3% nerf won't really change the outcome of Unholy being your highest DPS overall in your key. It will continue to be this pretty much by default. Right now, Unholy DKs are finishing keys between 10 to sometimes even 15% ahead of the opposition in your group. So being nerfed by 3 or so % isn't actually going to change the fact that Unholy is your top damage dealer in the key, and the reason why it is being chosen in this comp for its very wide AoE pools. It is still going to be exactly that, even after the nerf. The nerf would have had to be much more severe. We are talking about in the 10% range of nerf for you to start thinking. Could we start playing Assassination? Could we start playing something like Ret Paladin or Devastation Evoker over Unholy DK? But if the nerf is just in the 3% area, it's still not enough to move away Unholy from being a part of the meta comp in Mythic Plus. As we also mentioned already, it's not that most of the other balance tuning that is happening in a couple of days will have much to do with Mythic Plus, since many of the changes were more single target oriented, like the buffs given to both of the warriors, for example. The buff given to Red Paladin also was single target oriented. You did get a buff to Augmentation, but Augmentation was so far back, so far behind, it's unlikely to see them crawl back from the hole they have been this season. Who perhaps got the best buff given the situation they were already in was Feral, because Feral got a 3% ability and auto attack buff, and their overall damage in Mythic Plus was already pretty good. However, as we also mentioned, Feral also has to contend with balance when trying to find a spot for your keys, so that's kind of a problem for them. Oh yes, I'm sure this will be very surprising to everyone, but buffing the damage of Guardian Druid by 5% is also not really going to do anything for the spec into becoming any more meta right now. We can see the full swap. Before then they were still pretty even because most of the mage players were still, transitioning from fire to arcane. So at the time the top keys were still fire dominated, but after 10 days or so you can now see the score gap difference between fire and arcane. Now arcane went all the way up to match the average of Unholy DK, and about only like 12 score below balance. It is still pretty funny and somewhat sad, to be honest, that Feral is so far high up. Because in a season, if you ever wanted to find a season where Feral might have been meta, it also happened to be the very same season where balance is also meta. So even if you were to think, for example, what if we replace Arcane with another spec? What if Unholy gets nerfed and we can replace him with another spec? Players would start thinking about enhancement, about assassination, perhaps marksmanship, devastation, ret. They wouldn't even think about Feral, because you already have a druid in your group anyways. You want other specs to bring other things to your group. Even worse, in the case of this comp, you have the magical damage debuff of the Vengeance and the intellect buff of the mage. So just bring in a Feral druid over an elemental shaman, you would be losing basically 8% damage. Because the 5% magical damage debuff of the Vengeance, Feral doesn't do anything with it, and the 3% intellect of the mage buff, Feral doesn't do anything with it either. So it's a bit unfortunate for Feral to find the moment to be good at in the very same season where balance is also quite good. It's kind of, to be fair, it's kind of similar to last season where enhancement was very good at the same time as elemental, and one of the two had to lose out. And elemental ended up losing, and enhancement ended up being the meta spec. As mentioned, there will be a pretty big pause between this week and next week, because everyone is pretty much at this point just waiting for the item level bump that will happen with Turbo Boost event beginning May 13th. So everyone is just waiting to get 6 more item levels plus their best in slot trinket of choice, or if you are a mythic raider, maybe even a mythic Juster Diamond or a mythic best in slots weapon, for example. So there isn't much reason to try to wipe and try again and wipe and try again to clear a 17 right now, when you know that in about 10 days this will become significantly more doable by the power increase you will get. Back in the past, there was a lot of talk about how specs scaled with gear, scaled with item level, getting more secondary stats, about how certain specs can do much more with more secondary stats compared to others. For example, specs synergizing better with haste, or synergizing better with mastery, so having more item level, generally speaking, being deeper in the season, you get to max item level at the beginning of the season, you have like 7% crit, and now halfway through the expansion you have 35% crit, for example. So, back in those times, the idea of getting 6 more item levels and significantly increasing your power might have moved things around a bit in terms of power of certain specs. Maybe some specs will be able to gain even more value with this power jump compared to others. Nowadays, not really. Most specs can gain benefit from at least a couple of the secondary stats anyways, so even with this item level jump you can still expect basically the same specs to be good or as good as they were before this item level jump. And unfortunately, as mentioned, even after this balance tuning, there won't really be much of anything to be anxious or excited about, because the only one that could have moved things around was the nerf to Unholy, but as documented, the nerf to Unholy is just too small to do anything. So yes, we will be monitoring the slight loss in performance of Unholy in keys, but we won't really be expecting it to change anything of the status quo of the meta comp in Mythic Plus, being Discipline, Vengeance, Unholy, Balance, and now Arcane Mage. Of course, we haven't even gone over the state of tanks, because those are firmly in the grip, or we should say, I guess, in the chains of Vengeance. No change so far has made it anywhere close when it comes to the other tanks to match the CC and mob control of Vengeance, together with the current pretty good damage they are doing, as well as the help of being one of the tanks to have a cheat death, which is always quite nice to have. That has remained the same since the start of the season, and we don't really expect it to change anytime soon either. So for today, on this Sunday, this is what we can see when going over the state of Mythic Plus by the halfway through week 9 of the season. But for today, towards the end of this weekend, we can now leave each other. We are starting, as usual, the goodbyes by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone else who has been supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, out of nowhere, in classic spring style, we got some rain coming back. Rain and wind, a rare scene combo over here.